levelling up, which we've obviously heard loads about, and that's affecting transport infrastructure and all sorts of bits of the economy, but it also linked to culture, and every local authority in the country has been allocated against one of three kind of categories of priority in terms of levelling up. So there's category 1, which is high priority, 2, medium priority, and 3, you guessed it, lower priority. And we can see where all of these are across the country. So, large patches of Wales across the north, the borders, either side of the borders, and indeed the Kentish coast are all kind of in these high priority areas. Large swathes of the south, perhaps unsurprisingly, are in the lower priority band. And if we look at the population in each of those three tiers, unsurprisingly, yes, there's lots of variety because lots of different people live in lots of different places. But broadly speaking, there are more people in lower engaged, or typically lower engaged segments in the high priority areas than there are in the low priority areas. And this is probably one of those things you think, well, that's incredibly obvious. It's really, it's not that surprising, it's not that interesting. But I would agree. What I think is more interesting is when we start looking at that really properly split out, looking at these subsegments. So here we have the proportion of people in each subsegment within each of those three bands. So just to take an example, looking at the far left, metrocultural's M1, there's a very, very small proportion of them in the high priority areas, as you'd expect. There's slightly more, but still not loads, in the medium priority, and then there's slightly more, but really not that much more in the lowest priority area. So you see those kind of three little bars on the left, and that same picture is then repeated across the whole chart. So you can see there's quite a variety going on, but most interestingly, if we zoom in, looking at lower engaged groups, we see an odd pattern amongst these two groups in particular. So that's what we're going to zoom in on, the upper street and frontline families. So, though we've seen a broad pattern towards lower engaged groups being more represented in the priority areas, hence these solid bars being highest compared to the sort of hatched and pale ones, there's a substantial difference between the subsegments. So up our street is split into two groups, one which tends to be a bit more middle-aged, more like kind of semis on the edge of town, and the other one which is more like older terraces and flats in sort of more built-up areas. And of those two, the latter is much more likely to be overrepresented in levelling up areas. So there's a really big concentration. For the U1 group, they're really only marginally overrepresented at all compared to category 2 of the sort of medium priority. They're massively overrepresented for the older group. The flip side of that is that the frontline families, the younger group, who tends to be more financially hard pressed and to be younger, they tend to be either new families or couples sort of heading towards starting families, as opposed to the kind of older, slightly more established families. It's the younger group who are much more overrepresented amongst the levelling up areas. So if you're looking to program work in these areas in particular, or you're trying to understand behaviours in these areas in particular, it's more helpful to be looking at the subsegments and see the very particular behaviours and interests and patterns and comms preferences and profile and so forth of the subsegments, rather than just looking at the aggregate kind of, this is what up our street in general are like, because these subsegments are much more represented in that particular area.